Good evening, and welcome to another journey through history. One designed not to excite, but to soothe, to inform, and to gently carry you toward rest. Tonight, we turn our attention to a particular moment in time, not the moment itself, but the days that came before it. We will explore the ordinary routines of people living in Japan during the summer of 1945. In those final weeks before everything changed. We will walk through markets, listen to the sounds of streetcars, observe the quiet rituals of daily life in a country exhausted by war. We will not focus on the dramatic or the catastrophic tonight, but rather on the subtle, the mundane, the rhythms that continued even as history prepared to turn a corner that no one could see coming. Before we begin, take a moment now to settle yourself. Adjust your pillows, arrange your blankets, dim the lights or turn them off completely. Find that comfortable position, the one your body knows, the one that signals to your mind that it is time to let go of the day. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders drop, let the weight of your body sink into whatever surface supports you. We have time tonight, all the time we need, and there is no urgency here. No need to rush. I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. If you feel inclined, leave a comment below telling me your location, the city or country where you are settling in to hear this story. It is always a comfort to know that these words are traveling across the world, reaching people in different time zones. Different climates, different lives, all seeking the same gentle passage into sleep. And if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please consider doing so. It helps us continue creating these long, detailed, calming journeys through the quieter corners of history. Now, let us begin. Imagine yourself in Japan in the early months of 1945. The war that began years ago. That seemed at first like a distant storm affecting only soldiers and politicians. Has now seeped into every corner of daily existence. But life, as it always does, continues. People wake each morning, not because they feel hopeful or energized, but because waking is what one does. The sun rises over cities and villages, over mountains and coastlines. Indifferent to human suffering, indifferent to politics, simply performing its ancient routine. And beneath that sun, millions of people perform their own routines. Smaller and more constrained than before, but routines nonetheless. Picture a small shop in a neighborhood that might exist in any number of Japanese cities. It is early, perhaps 6 in the morning, and the shopkeeper is unlocking the door. The metal key turns in the lock with a familiar click, a sound he has heard thousands of times. He pushes the door open, and it makes that same small creak it has always made. The one he keeps meaning to oil but never quite gets around to fixing. Inside, the shop is dim and cool, smelling faintly of wood and paper and the residue of whatever goods passed through yesterday. He moves through the space with the automatic grace of long habit, not thinking about his movements, his hands knowing where everything is even in the half-darkness. He begins the morning tasks, sweeping the floor, though there is little dirt to sweep, arranging the few items he has for sale, though the shelves that were once full now show large gaps. Rice is rationed, and he has only a small allotment to distribute. There are some vegetables, fewer than last month, and certainly fewer than last year. There are a few household items. Things made from substitute materials because metal and rubber have all gone to the war effort. Everything is a shadow of what it once was, but still, the shop opens. Still, customers will come. Still, the day unfolds according to its pattern. Down the street, a train arrives at a small station. It is not on time. It is rarely on time anymore, but it arrives. The sound of it approaching is familiar, the distant rumble that grows louder, the squeal of brakes, the hiss of steam. People waiting on the platform gather their belongings, their worn bags and bundles. They do not rush There is a weariness in their movements, but they board efficiently, filing into cars that are more crowded than they used to be. Inside, the seats are mostly full, and many people stand, holding on to straps and rails, swaying together as the train pulls away from the station. No one speaks much. Conversations, when they happen, are brief and quiet. People stare out windows or at nothing in particular, lost in their own thoughts, their own private tallies of worry and endurance. In a classroom somewhere, a teacher enters and sets her materials on the desk at the front of the room. The students, children ranging perhaps from 8 to 12 years old, are already seated. They stand and bow when she enters, a gesture of respect performed countless times, as automatic as breathing. She bows in return, and they all sit. The classroom is sparse. Some of the desks are empty, children sent away to the countryside for safety, or fathers reassigned and families moved. The walls, once decorated with colourful papers and student artwork, now display patriotic slogans and reminders about air raid procedures. The teacher begins the lesson, her voice calm and measured, covering mathematics or language or history, the curriculum continuing because what else would it do? The children listen, or pretend to listen, their young faces showing the peculiar tiredness that comes from chronic anxiety, even if they do not have the words to name what they feel. Life is already strained, that much is obvious. The abundance of the past, even the modest abundance of ordinary peacetime life, is gone. Food is limited, and people have learned to feel satisfied with less, to stretch ingredients, to make do with substitutes. Sugar is a memory. Meat is rare. Fish is less plentiful. Meals are simple and small, and people rise from the table still feeling the edge of hunger. But not the sharp pang of starvation, not yet. It is a careful balance, a slow diminishment that the body and mind adjust to incrementally, so that each day feels manageable even, as it is measurably harder than the day before. Men are gone. Not all men, but enough that their absence reshapes everything. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, all pulled into the machinery of war. The ones who remain are mostly the very young, the very old, or those deemed unfit for military service for one reason or another. Women have stepped into roles that were once unthinkable, working in factories, managing businesses, making decisions that used to belong to men. This shift has happened gradually, out of necessity rather than ideology, and it carries with it a strange mixture of burden and capability. Women are tired, deeply tired, but they are also competent. Their hands learning new skills, their minds adapting to new responsibilities. Cities are darker at night. The blackout regulations are strict, enforced by neighbourhood associations and air raid wardens. As evening falls, windows are covered with thick curtains or wooden shutters, ensuring that no light escapes to guide enemy bombers. Street lamps remain unlit. The darkness is profound, disorienting for those who remember when cities glowed. Walking through streets at night requires caution, a hand trailing along walls, eyes straining to make out shapes. The darkness feels oppressive, but also strangely intimate, as if the city has pulled a blanket over itself, trying to hide, trying to become invisible. But nothing feels like the end yet. That is the remarkable thing, the detail that might seem impossible from a distance, but is entirely ordinary when you are inside it. People still wake up. They still perform their ablutions, washing their faces in cold water, combing their hair, dressing in clothes that are increasingly patched and faded. They still cook, coaxing flavour from meagre ingredients, boiling rice, preparing miso soup with whatever they can find. They still sweep the floor, because disorder feels like surrender, and maintaining order, even small domestic order, feels like an assertion of normalcy. They still make plans for tomorrow, modest plans, plans that assume tomorrow will come and will look roughly like today. This is the nature of human existence, this commitment to the ordinary even in extraordinary circumstances. The mind cannot sustain constant crisis. It finds ways to normalize, to create routine, to carve out small spaces of predictability. A woman hangs laundry to dry and thinks about when she will need to take it down. A man tends a tiny vegetable garden and considers whether the tomatoes will ripen before the next cold spell. A child practices writing characters, tongue between teeth in concentration, trying to get the brush strokes just right. These small actions, these minor concerns, they fill up the day. They provide structure. They give people something to do with their hands and their minds. The world almost always feels normal right before it does not. This is a truth that echoes across history, across cultures, across centuries. People living through what will later be called pivotal moments, turning points, catastrophes. Those people almost never feel the weight of historical significance pressing down on them. They feel Tuesday. They feel hunger, fatigue, mild irritation, brief moments of pleasure. They feel the texture of their own lives, which is always granular, always specific, always composed of small things rather than large concepts. In early 1945, in Japan, people are living in a version of normal that has slowly, incrementally, become something quite different from normal. But the transformation has been so gradual that it is difficult to perceive. Each small adjustment, each new restriction, each additional hardship, these are absorbed and accommodated. People compare today not to 5 years ago, but to yesterday, to last week. And by that measure, things are manageable. Difficult, yes. Exhausting, certainly. But manageable. Consider the housewife preparing breakfast for her family. She has less to work with than she did last month, and far less than she had last year. But she still has something. She still has rice, even if the portion is small. She still has vegetables from the garden, even if the variety is limited. She still has miso paste, even if it is not the quality she prefers. She arranges the meal on the table, small bowls and plates, everything in its proper place. Her husband, too old to be drafted, sits down. Her children sit down. They eat together, quietly, the ritual of the family meal continuing. There is comfort in this, in the repetition, in the familiar arrangement of bodies around a table. After breakfast, the children leave for school, walking in small groups through streets they know intimately. They notice things adults might overlook, the way children do. A cat sunning itself on a wall. A beetle making its way across the sidewalk. A shop window that used to display toys but now stands empty. They chatter to each other, or they walk in silence, depending on their temperament. The war is part of their reality, but it is not the entirety of their reality. They are still children, still curious, still capable of distraction and play, even if the opportunities for both have diminished. In offices and factories, work continues. The nature of the work has shifted, almost everything now oriented toward the war effort in some way. But the basic structure of the workday remains. People arrive, they perform tasks, they take brief breaks, they eat a simple lunch, they continue until evening. The work is often tedious, sometimes physically demanding, occasionally dangerous. But it is also familiar, and familiarity breeds a kind of comfort, even when the circumstances are uncomfortable. People know what is expected of them. They know how to perform their role. And in knowing, there is a small measure of control. Imagine a man working in a factory that produces parts for aircraft. He stands at his station, repeating the same motions over and over. His hands are skilled, his movements efficient. He has done this thousands of times. His mind wanders as his hands work. thinking about his son serving somewhere in the Pacific, wondering when the next letter will arrive, hoping it will arrive. He thinks about his wife, about whether there will be anything worthwhile at the market today. He thinks about his own fatigue, the way his back aches, the way his eyes feel strained. But he does not stop working. Stopping is not an option. So he continues, in the rhythm that his body knows, hour after hour. At midday, sirens might sound, the wailing alert that signals an air raid drill, or sometimes an actual air raid. People move to shelters, basements, reinforced spaces. They carry with them whatever they have deemed essential, a small bag prepared and kept always within reach. They wait in the dim, close spaces, surrounded by neighbours and strangers, breathing the same stale air. Sometimes bombs fall, distant thunder that makes the ground tremble. Sometimes nothing happens, and after a period of waiting, the all-clear sounds and people return to what they were doing. Either way, the interruption becomes part of the routine. Life reses. In the afternoon, an elderly man sits in his small garden, tending to plants that provide a supplemental source of food. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, move gently among the leaves, pulling weeds, checking for pests. The garden is modest, just a small plot behind his house, but it is his domain, his contribution. He cannot fight, he cannot work in a factory, but he can grow vegetables. And so he does. The work is slow and peaceful, the sun warm on his back, the smell of earth rich and grounding. For these moments, he is not thinking about the war. He is thinking about the plants, about water and light and soil, about the simple mechanics of growth. Across the city, a young woman delivers messages, cycling through streets with a bag of letters and notices. She has taken on this job because it is needed, because so many young men are gone, and because she needs the small wage it provides. She pedals steadily, her legs strong from months of this work, her route memorized. She knows which houses to visit, which doors to knock on. Some of the messages she delivers are routine, administrative notices, ration, card updates. Some are letters from soldiers, and she can often tell by the recipient's face whether the news is good or bad or simply neutral. She does not linger. She hands over the envelope or paper, nods politely and moves on to the next address. Evening arrives, as it always does. The light changes, becoming softer, more golden. Shadows lengthen. People begin to make their way home, trickling through streets and along pathways, moving toward the small private spaces that represent safety and rest. Shops close, shutters pulled down, locks turned. The train station sees another surge of commuters, tired workers returning from the city. Dinner is prepared in countless kitchens, simple meals assembled from limited ingredients. But meals nonetheless, food and warmth and the comfort of home. As darkness falls, the blackout curtains go up. Every household performs this ritual, ensuring that no crack of light shows. The streets become very dark, almost oppressively so. Inside, families gather in dim rooms, lit by minimal lamps or candles. Conversations are quiet. There might be a radio playing softly, broadcasts that mix music with propaganda. News that is carefully controlled, shaped to maintain morale and compliance. People listen with varying degrees of attention, some focused, some merely letting the sound fill the silence. Children are put to bed. Parents tuck them in, even though the children are older now, more capable of managing themselves. But the ritual continues because rituals matter, because they provide structure. Because in tucking a child in, a parent is asserting that tomorrow will come, that sleep is safe, that the world will still be here in the morning. The children close their eyes, some falling asleep quickly, exhausted from the day. Others lying awake longer, listening to the sounds of the house, the muffled voices of adults, the creak of floorboards, the distant sound of a dog barking. Adults stay up a bit longer, attending to small tasks, mending clothes, writing letters, simply sitting in the quiet. There is a quality to these evening hours, a stillness that feels both peaceful and heavy. People are tired, but sleep does not always come easily. Worry is a constant companion, sitting in the chest, tightening the throat. Worry about loved ones far away. Worry about food running out. Worry about bombs, about illness, about the future that seems so uncertain. But worry, like everything else, becomes something people carry, something they learn to hold without letting it consume them entirely. And eventually, sleep does come. People lie down in their beds, in their futons spread on tatami mats, and they close their eyes. Some pray. Some simply exhale and let go. And in that surrender, in that nightly release, there is a kind of trust, an unspoken belief that morning will arrive, that the sun will rise, that the routine will begin again. Because that is what has always happened. That is what the mind expects. The world almost always feels normal, right up until the moment it does not. Let us move now, gently, into the second part of our journey tonight. We have seen how life continued, how routines persisted, how the ordinary day unfolded even in extraordinary times. Now we will explore something more subtle. The way war does not arrive all at once, like a thunderclap, but rather seeps in gradually, like water finding its way through small cracks, spreading slowly until it has touched everything. We will look at how the conflict that seemed distant at first became intimate, became daily, became woven into the fabric of existence so thoroughly that people could barely remember what life was like before. The intrusion began with paper. That is often how these things start, with documents, with official notices, with new rules written in formal language and distributed to every household. Ration cards appeared, and with them a new system for obtaining food. The cards were small, printed on thin paper that seemed too flimsy to carry such weight. But they determined what you could eat, how much, when. Each person received an allotment based on age, occupation, health status. The cards were divided into small squares, coupons that would be torn out or stamped when you made a purchase, each one representing a specific commodity: rice, wheat, sugar, oil, fish. At first, the ration system seemed manageable, even reasonable. After all, there was a war. Resources needed to be directed to the military. Sacrifices were necessary. People accepted this logic, or at least they did not openly resist it. They took their ration cards to the designated shops and exchanged the appropriate coupons for their allotment. The shopkeepers became gatekeepers of a sort, checking cards, tearing out coupons, measuring portions with careful precision. There was no room for generosity, no opportunity for extra. The system was exact. But as months passed, the allotments shrank. What had been sufficient became inadequate. What had been inadequate became barely enough. And then barely enough became not quite enough. The change was incremental, a slow tightening of the belt, so gradual that it was difficult to pinpoint exactly when things shifted from difficult to truly hard. People adjusted their expectations. They learned to feel full on less. They learned to ignore the persistent low hum of hunger that became a constant companion. They learned to stop thinking about the foods they used to enjoy, because longing for what was unavailable only made the present harder to bear. Women, particularly, bore the burden of making rations stretch. They became alchemists in their kitchens, transforming meagre ingredients into meals that could sustain their families. They learned to substitute, to improvise, to extract every possible bit of nutrition and flavour from what little they had. Vegetables were used entirely, roots and stems and leaves, nothing wasted. Broths were made from scraps. Rice was stretched by adding barley or other grains. Creativity born of necessity became a daily practice, a quiet heroism that no one celebrated because everyone was doing it. Children learned to eat what they were given without complaint. This was not always natural to them, children being children, with their preferences and their resistances. But hunger is a powerful teacher. They learned that asking for more was pointless. They learned to eat slowly, to make the meal last, to savor each bite not out of mindful appreciation, but out of the knowledge that this was all there would be. They learned to watch their parents carefully, noticing when their mother would eat less so that they could have more, understanding, without words, the sacrifices being made on their behalf. Air raid drills became another regular intrusion, another way war entered daily life. At first, these drills felt urgent, frightening even, a disruption that sent hearts racing and hands trembling. Sirens would wail, that distinctive rising and falling sound designed to pierce through everything else, to demand attention, to signal danger. And people would respond, moving quickly to designated shelters, basements, reinforced rooms. They would huddle together in the dim spaces, listening, waiting, wondering if this time it was real. But as with all things repeated often enough, the drills became routine. The fear did not disappear entirely, but it changed shape, became something people carried rather than something that overwhelmed them. When the sirens sounded, people moved with practiced efficiency rather than panic. They knew where to go, what to bring, how long to wait. Teachers would lead their students to shelters with calm instructions, counting heads, ensuring everyone was accounted for. Office workers would file out of buildings in orderly lines. Shopkeepers would close their doors and join their neighbours in communal shelters. The waiting in shelters became its own strange ritual. People sat close together, the space always too small for comfort, the air quickly becoming stale and warm. Some would talk quietly, sharing rumours, speculating about the war's progress, discussing the challenges of daily life. Others sat in silence, lost in their own thoughts, conserving energy for whatever came next. Children, initially frightened by the sirens and the darkness and the tension in adult faces, gradually became accustomed to it. They learned to sit still, to wait patiently, sometimes even falling asleep against a parent's shoulder, their small bodies surrendering to exhaustion despite the circumstances. Blackout curtains transformed the nights. Every window in every building had to be covered completely once darkness fell, ensuring that no light escaped that might guide enemy bombers. The regulations were specific and strictly enforced. Neighborhood associations appointed wardens who would patrol the streets after dark, looking for any violation, any slip of light showing through a crack or gap. If they found one, they would knock sharply on the door, reprimanding the household, demanding immediate compliance. The darkness this created was profound. Cities that had once glowed with electric light, that had shimmered and sparkled after sunset, now went black. Streets were nearly impossible to navigate without a small, heavily shaded flashlight, and even those were used sparingly. People learned to move slowly through the darkness, hands outstretched, feeling their way along walls and fences. Stumbling was common. Minor injuries from walking into unseen obstacles became routine. The darkness felt oppressive, claustrophobic, as if the night itself had become heavier, thicker, more confining. Inside homes, people adapted to living in dimness. Lights were kept to a minimum, just enough to see by, but no more. Families gathered in single rooms to conserve both light and heat, their bodies and their small lamps creating pockets of warmth and visibility in the larger darkness. There was an intimacy to this, a closeness forced by circumstance. Conversations happened in lower voices, as if the darkness demanded quietness. Activities that required good light, reading, detailed handwork, became difficult or impossible. Evenings grew longer, emptier, filled with waiting for a sleep that would allow the next day to begin. Sirens that went off but resulted in nothing became perhaps the most exhausting intrusion of all. False alarms, or drills, or alerts that were called off. These disrupted life without the resolution of actual danger. People would go through the entire process, gathering belongings, moving to shelters, waiting in tense anticipation, only to hear the all-clear signal without any bombs falling, without any visible threat. Relief and frustration would mix together in equal measure. Relief that they were safe, frustration that their time and energy had been spent, that their routines had been interrupted for nothing. This pattern, repeated over and over, created a peculiar psychological state. People began to doubt their own responses. When sirens sounded, should they hurry or should they move casually, assuming it was another false alarm? The gamble was dangerous. Move too slowly and you might be caught unprotected if it was real. Move too quickly every time and you exhausted yourself over nothing. People tried to read signs, to detect patterns, to develop intuitions about which alerts were serious. But there was no reliable way to know. And so they lived in a constant state of uncertain vigilance, neither fully relaxed nor fully alarmed, suspended in between. People got used to fear. This is a remarkable adaptation, one that speaks to the resilience and the tragedy of human psychology. Fear, when it is constant, when it has no clear resolution, gradually transforms from an acute emotion into a chronic condition, becomes part of the background, like tinnitus, all present, but not always noticed. People learn to function while afraid, to carry on conversations, to perform work, to make decisions, all while a low level of anxiety hummed beneath everything else. They got used to checking the sky, scanning for aircraft, listening for the sound of engines. They got used to the tight feeling in their chest, the slight tremor in their hands, the difficulty sleeping. These became normal. Children, especially, demonstrated this adaptation. They would play games that incorporated air raid drills, acting out scenarios of sirens and shelters with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children bring to their world, whatever that world might be. They drew pictures of planes and soldiers. They collected shrapnel from bombs that had fallen in their neighborhoods. Trading pieces like other children might trade marbles or cards. The war was their normal, the baseline against which they measured experience. They had no robust memory of peace to compare it to, and so they simply lived in what was, adapting with the extraordinary flexibility of young minds. They got used to hunger. The body is remarkably capable of adjusting to reduced caloric intake, at least for a time. Metabolism's slow. Energy is conserved. The constant gnawing feeling in the stomach becomes something you notice less. Or perhaps more accurately, something you acknowledge but do not dwell on. People learned not to talk about food because talking about it made the hunger worse, made the longing more acute. They learned to distract themselves, to focus on other things, to keep busy so that the emptiness in their belly did not fill their entire consciousness. Meals became events to look forward to, not because they were satisfying, but because they were markers in the day. Small rituals that broke up the monotony. The anticipation of eating, even when you knew the meal would be small and simple, provided a kind of psychological sustenance. Something to move toward, something to organize time around. People ate slowly, making each bite last, chewing thoroughly, trying to extract maximum sensation from minimum food. And after eating, there would be a brief period of contentment, not fullness, but at least the temporary quieting of hunger's voice. They got used to uncertainty. Not knowing became a permanent state. Not knowing when the war would end. Not knowing if loved ones were safe. Not knowing whether tomorrow would bring disaster or simply more of the same grinding difficulty. This uncertainty was perhaps the most corrosive element of all. Because it prevented planning, prevented hope from taking solid form, prevented the mind from constructing a clear path forward. People existed in a state of suspension, unable to move backward to how things were, unable to move forward to how things might be, stuck in the difficult present with no clear sense of duration. War became background noise. This phrase captures something essential about how humans adapt to ongoing crisis. What begins as shocking and all-consuming gradually recedes into the background, becoming the context within which life happens rather than the event that stops life. People stopped talking about the war constantly, not because it was unimportant, but because what was there to say. It was everywhere, affecting everything, and constant discussion of it served no purpose. Better to talk about small things, immediate things, the concerns of the day that could actually be addressed. Conversations at the market, when women gathered to wait for shops to open or to compare notes about where supplies might be available. These conversations focused on practical matters. Which shops had received new stock? What substitutes could be used for items no longer available? How to repair clothing that was wearing out? Who had received letters from the front and what those letters contained? The war was present in all of these discussions, but indirectly, woven into the fabric of daily concern rather than named explicitly. Men, when they gathered, might talk more directly about the war's progress, about battles and strategy, about what they had heard on the radio or through the rumor networks that spread information faster than official channels. But even these conversations had a quality of remoteness to them, as if they were discussing events in a story rather than the reality that shaped their lives. It was easier, perhaps, to treat it as abstract as something happening elsewhere, even when the evidence of its nearness was all around them. In Wokokus Rimes, on production on Mikotas, the war was the reason for the work, but the work itself became all-consuming, demanding attention and effort. People took a certain refuge in the specificity of their tasks, in the clear expectations and measurable outcomes. Complete this many units. Process this many forms. Teach this lesson plan. The concreteness of work provided structure, purpose, a sense of contribution that helped counter the helplessness that uncertainty bred. Evenings, after work, after the day's obligations were met, people had less energy for worry. Exhaustion became an ally in this sense, dulling the sharp edges of anxiety, making it easier to simply exist without thinking too much. People would sit quietly, too tired for conversation, letting the silence be enough. They would listen to the radio with half attention, letting the sound wash over them without really processing it. They would perform small tasks that required no mental effort. Folding clothes, sweeping, arranging things, movements that soothed through their very repetitiveness. And through all of this, through the rationing and the drills and the blackouts and the sirens, through the fear and the hunger and the uncertainty, life continued. People still laughed occasionally, usually at small absurdities, at the ridiculousness of some regulation or the irony of some situation. Humour became darker, more sardonic, but it survived. People still found moments of beauty, a sunset glimpsed between buildings, a flower blooming in a crack in the pavement, a child's unself-conscious joy at some small discovery. These moments were brief, easily overshadowed, but they existed. People still helped each other, sharing what little they had when a neighbour was in greater need, checking on the elderly, watching out for each other's children. Community bonds, strained by the competition for scarce resources, nevertheless held in many places. The shared experience of hardship created a kind of solidarity, an unspoken understanding that everyone was struggling. Everyone was afraid. Everyone was doing their best to endure. This solidarity was not always visible, not always expressed in grand gestures, but it showed up in small acts of kindness, in patience with each other's frayed nerves, in the willingness to help when help was needed. The slow intrusion of war into daily life was complete. There was no aspect of existence it had not touched, no corner of consciousness it had not infiltrated. But humans, being humans, had normalized it, had adapted to it, had found ways to continue living within it. This was not courage in the heroic sense, not a conscious choice to be brave, but rather the simple, stubborn persistence of life itself, the way people keep going because the alternative is unthinkable, because giving up is not really an option, because tomorrow will come whether we are ready for it or not, and we might as well be there to meet it. We turn now to a question that sits at the heart of how people experience history as it unfolds around them. What did they know, and what did they not know? What information reached them, and what remained hidden? How did they understand their situation, and where did their understanding fail them? This is not a simple matter of facts versus lies, though there were certainly lies. It is more subtle than that, more complicated, having to do with the nature of information itself, how it travels, how it is shaped, how it is received and interpreted by minds that are trying to make sense of circumstances that are often deliberately obscured. Propaganda was everywhere. This is the first thing to understand. The government controlled all major channels of communication. The newspapers, the radio broadcasts, the newsreels shown in cinemas, the posters plastered on walls and displayed in public spaces. The messages were carefully crafted, designed to maintain morale, to encourage sacrifice, to frame the war in terms that made continued suffering seem necessary and honourable. Japan was portrayed as defending itself against aggressive Western powers, as leading the liberation of Asia, as fulfilling a sacred destiny. Victories were announced with great fanfare, defeats were minimized or reframed or simply not mentioned at all. The tone of this propaganda was relentlessly optimistic, at least on the surface. Posters showed strong, determined soldiers and workers, everyone contributing to the war effort with fierce dedication. Slogans emphasized unity, perseverance, the inevitability of final victory. The language was elevated, almost poetic at times, invoking ancient traditions. The warrior spirit, the divine protection of the nation. It was designed to inspire, to create a sense of collective purpose, to make individual hardship feel meaningful within a larger narrative. But propaganda, no matter how skillfully executed, cannot completely obscure reality when reality is pressing in from all sides. People could see with their own eyes that conditions were deteriorating. They could feel their own hunger, could notice the increasing absence of goods in shops, could observe the growing number of women and elderly men doing work that young men used to do. They could count the number of funerals in their neighbourhood, could track which families had received the dreaded notification that a son or husband had been killed in action. The gap between the optimistic official narrative and the difficult lived experience created a kind of cognitive dissonance that people had to manage constantly. Censorship ensured that certain information never reached the public at all. Letters from soldiers serving overseas were read by military censors who redacted anything deemed sensitive or demoralizing. Newspapers were not permitted to publish stories that might undermine public confidence or reveal strategic vulnerabilities. Discussions that questioned the war effort or the government's decisions were dangerous, potentially treasonous. People learned to be careful about what they said, even in private, because neighbours might report conversations, because children might innocently repeat something their parents said, because the consequences of being perceived as disloyal could be severe. This created an atmosphere of guardedness, a sense that one had to monitor one's own speech constantly. People became adept at reading between the lines, at interpreting what was not said, at detecting the careful omissions and euphemisms that signalled bad news. When the radio announced that forces had made a strategic withdrawal, people understood this meant a defeat. When casualty numbers were not mentioned, people assumed they were high. When a particular battle or campaign stopped being discussed altogether, people inferred that it had gone badly. Rumours filled the spaces that official information left empty. Rumours spread through informal networks, passed along in quiet conversations at markets, in workplaces, in homes. Some rumours were based on fragments of real information, things people had heard from someone who knew someone who had received a letter from the front, or overheard from a military officer, or gleaned from a foreign radio broadcast that someone had secretly listened to despite the prohibition against doing so. Other rumours were pure speculation, fears and hopes given narrative form, stories that people wanted to believe or were afraid might be true. The reliability of rumours was impossible to assess. Some turned out to be accurate, validated weeks or months later when official information finally caught up. Others were completely false, products of misunderstanding or deliberate disinformation, or simply the distortions that occur when information is passed from person to person without verification. But in the absence of trustworthy official channels, rumours were what people had. And so they circulated, endlessly discussed, debated, compared with other rumours, used to construct a picture of reality that might or might not bear much resemblance to what was actually happening. People knew Japan was losing. This knowledge existed in a strange, unspoken way, not fully articulated, not openly acknowledged, but present nonetheless. The trajectory was clear to anyone paying attention. The initial victories of the war's early years had given way to stalemate and then to gradual retreat. Territory that had been conquered was being lost. Supply lines were being cut. The frequency of air raids was increasing. The desperation in the government's exhortations for greater sacrifice suggested that things were not going well. People could feel the momentum shifting, could sense that the optimistic narrative was hollow, could see that the end, when it came, was unlikely to be the glorious victory they had been promised. But knowing in this vague, intuitive way was different from knowing specifics. People did not have access to accurate information about where battles were being fought, how many ships had been sunk, how many planes had been shot down, how many soldiers had died. They did not know the strategic situation, did not understand the decisions being made by military and political leaders, did not have any clear sense of timeline or what the next phase of the war might bring. Their knowledge was more emotional than factual. A feeling in the gut that things were bad and getting worse, without clear data to support or quantify that feeling. They knew cities were being bombed. This was impossible to hide. Air raids had become frequent, particularly against industrial centres and major cities. People in those areas experienced the bombing directly, the sound of planes overhead, the explosions, the fires, the destruction. People in other areas heard about it through the communication networks that still functioned, through letters, through refugees fleeing bombed cities, through the occasional acknowledgement in official broadcasts that an air raid had occurred and damage had been sustained. The scale of destruction was often minimized in official accounts, but people could extrapolate, could understand that if their city had been hit, other cities were being hit too, probably worse. But they did not know that something entirely new was coming. This is crucial. The atomic bomb was beyond the scope of civilian imagination, beyond even the imagination of most military personnel. The science behind it, the physics of nuclear fission, the engineering challenges of creating such a weapon. These were secrets held by a tiny number of people in a very small number of locations. The Manhattan Project was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, and its existence was unknown not just to Japanese civilians but to the vast majority of people in allied countries as well. Even if someone had tried to explain the concept, it would have seemed like science fiction. The idea that a single bomb could destroy an entire city, that it could release energy equivalent to thousands of tons of conventional explosives, that it could create temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun and radiation that would poison the land and the people for years afterward. These ideas were so far outside normal experience that they would have been dismissed as impossible, as propaganda, as the fevered imaginings of someone unmoored from reality. No one was thinking about atomic physics. The concerns of daily life were so much more immediate, so much more pressing. People were thinking about rice, about where to obtain it, how to stretch it, how to make it last until the next ration distribution. They were thinking about the quality of the vegetables they could grow in their small gardens, about whether the tomatoes would ripen, whether the leafy greens would survive. They were thinking about fuel for cooking, for heating, about how to stay warm as winter approached, about whether they could find charcoal or wood or any combustible material. They were thinking about letters from sons. This was perhaps the most consuming concern for many families, the waiting for word from loved ones serving in the military. Mail was irregular, often delayed by weeks or months, subject to routing problems and censorship and the general chaos of wartime logistics. When a letter arrived, it was a moment of profound relief mixed with anxiety, the relief of knowing that at least at the moment of writing, their son or husband or brother was alive, the anxiety about what the letter might contain, whether it would reveal hardship or danger or simply the careful neutrality that censorship imposed. Letters were read and reread, the paper becoming soft and creased from handling. People tried to read between the lines, to detect mood and circumstance from word choice and what was not said. They looked for clues about location, though soldiers were forbidden from revealing where they were stationed. They searched for reassurance, for some indication that their loved one was coping, was safe, was coming home eventually. The absence of letters was worse than bad news, because it left the imagination free to conjure worst-case scenarios, to assume the silence meant death or capture or wounds too severe to allow writing. The informational world that most people inhabited was small, bounded by their immediate experience and the limited channels through which information could reach them. They knew their neighborhood, their city, their immediate circumstances with great specificity. They could tell you which shops had stock and which were empty, which streets were damaged from bombing and which were intact, which families were struggling most and which had managed to maintain some stability. This local knowledge was rich and detailed, accumulated through daily observation and participation. But their knowledge of the larger world, of the war as a whole, of geopolitical strategy, of the decisions being made far away that would determine their fate, this knowledge was fragmentary at best, often inaccurate, shaped more by rumour and propaganda than by reliable information. They existed in a kind of informational fog, able to see clearly only the ground immediately around them, with everything else obscured by distance and deliberate concealment and the simple impossibility of knowing things that no one was telling them. This gap between what people knew and what was actually happening created a vulnerability. They could not prepare for what they could not imagine. They could not make informed decisions about their safety or their future because the information they would need to make such decisions was not available to them. They were, in a very real sense, at the mercy of events they could not see coming, moved by forces they could not fully comprehend, subject to decisions made by people they would never meet based on considerations they would never understand. And yet, within the bounds of what they did know, people tried to make rational choices. They tried to protect themselves and their families as best they could. They moved to the countryside if they had connections there and if circumstances permitted, trying to escape the bombing of cities. They stored what food they could, hoarding rice and other staples against future shortages. They taught their children to be cautious, to follow air raid procedures, to be respectful and obedient so as not to draw negative attention from authorities. They did what people always do. They used the information available to them to navigate their circumstances, never fully aware of how incomplete that information was. Teachers continue to teach, following curricula that had been adjusted to emphasize patriotic themes and practical skills useful for the war effort. Students learned mathematics, but the problems they solved involved calculating distances for aircraft or rationing supplies for soldiers. They learned history, but the narrative was shaped to glorify Japanese traditions and justify current policies. They practiced air raid drills until the procedures were automatic. They contributed to the war effort by collecting scrap metal, by writing letters of encouragement to soldiers, by participating in campaigns to boost morale. The education they received was both genuine and distorted, containing real knowledge but embedded in a framework of propaganda that shaped how they understood that knowledge. Factory workers produced materials for the war without fully understanding what those materials would be used for. A worker making parts for aircraft might know he was contributing to the production of bombers, but he would not know where those bombers would fly or what targets they would hit, or whether the bombing campaigns were succeeding or failing. His world was the factory floor, the specific task assigned to him, the quota he needed to meet, the quality standards he needed to maintain. The larger strategic picture was invisible to him, irrelevant to his daily work, outside the scope of what he needed to know to do his job. Housewives managed households with information that was primarily experiential. They knew through direct observation how much food their families needed, how quickly supplies ran out, what could be substituted for what, how to make clothing last longer, how to maintain health with limited resources. This knowledge was practical, accumulated through trial and error, shared among women through informal networks of mutual support. But they did not know policy decisions that affected food distribution, did not understand the larger economic forces that determined what was available in shops, did not have access to information about when conditions might improve or how much worse they might get. Children absorbed the world around them with the unfiltered directness of youth. They knew fear because they felt it, the visceral response to sirens and explosions and the tension in adult faces. They knew hunger because their stomachs were empty. They knew absence because fathers and older brothers were gone. But they did not know context, did not understand why the war was happening, did not grasp the historical forces and political decisions that had led to their current situation. They lived entirely in the present moment, adapting to each change as it came without the burden of understanding or the weight of historical consciousness. The information landscape was, in essence, designed to keep people functional but uninformed, capable of continuing their daily contributions to the war effort, but incapable of forming independent judgments about the war's conduct or outcome. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate structure of control, maintained through censorship and propaganda and the punishment of dissent. And IT worked to the extent that people continued to show up for work, continued to ration carefully, continued to follow instructions, continued to endure, even as the situation deteriorated around them. But it also meant that when change came, when the unimaginable happened, people were completely unprepared. They had been living in a carefully constructed informational environment that bore only partial resemblance to reality. And when reality so terrible force, the gap between what they thought they knew and what was actually true became devastatingly clear. Most people lived inside very small informational worlds, worlds that seemed complete and coherent from the inside, but were in fact fragments, partial views, carefully curated versions of a much larger and more complex and more dangerous reality that was unfolding just beyond their awareness. Let us narrow our lens now, moving from the general to the specific, from the broad patterns of wartime life to particular cities in the final days before everything changed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki in July and early August of 1945. Places where people lived and worked and hoped and worried. Places that were about to become names that would echo through history. Though the people living there in those summer days had no way of knowing what was coming. We will walk through their streets, observe their routines, notice the small details of ordinary life continuing in the shadow of extraordinary events that had not yet occurred. Hiroshima sits on the delta of the Ota River. Water flowing through the city in multiple channels, creating a landscape of bridges and islands. A geography that shapes movement and creates neighborhoods with distinct characters. It is a city of perhaps 300,000 people, though that number has fluctuated as some residents have been evacuated and others have arrived seeking work in the military installations and factories. The city has industrial significance, home to military headquarters, munitions factories, supply depots, the infrastructure of war woven into the fabric of a place that also contains schools and temples and markets and homes. All the elements of civilian life existing alongside military purpose. In July, the weather is hot. Summer settles over the city with heavy humidity, the kind that makes clothing stick to skin. That turns any physical exertion into a sweaty endeavor that makes people seek shade and move slowly to conserve energy. The sun rises early, bright and merciless, climbing into a sky that is often clear, occasionally punctuated by clouds that promise rain but do not always deliver. By midday, the heat is intense, shimmering off pavement, making the air itself seem thick and hard to breathe. Evenings bring some relief, temperatures dropping slightly. Breezes coming off the water, but the heat lingers, making sleep difficult, leaving people restless. Markets open early, taking advantage of the cooler morning hours. Vendors arrive before dawn, setting up their stalls, arranging what goods they have to sell. The selection is limited, as it is everywhere, but there is still commerce, still exchange, still the ancient ritual of people gathering to trade. Housewives come with their ration cards and their small amounts of cash, moving from stall to stall, comparing quality and price, negotiating when possible, making careful decisions about how to allocate their meager resources. The conversations are practiced, familiar. The social lubrication that makes transaction possible. Inquiries about health and family mixed with discussion of vegetables and fish. The fish available are smaller than they used to be, catches reduced by the demands of feeding the military, by the disruption of fishing operations, by the depletion of stocks. But there are still fish, and the sight of them laid out on ice or woven grass. Their scales catching the early light provides a moment of abundance in a landscape of scarcity. Women select carefully, judging freshness by the clarity of eyes and the firmness of flesh. Skills passed down through generations, knowledge embedded in hands and senses. Vegetables come mostly from local gardens and small farms on the city's outskirts. Tomatoes, cucumbers, eggplant, leafy greens, the produce of summer all making their appearance. The quality varies, some pieces perfect, others showing the strain of poor soil or insufficient water or pest damage. But all of it valuable, all of it necessary. People have learned not to be too particular, to accept what is available rather than holding out for some ideal that no longer exists. A slightly wilted cabbage is still cabbage, a cucumber with a blemish is still edible, and waste is unthinkable. Streetcars run through the city, connecting neighborhoods, carrying people to work and school and appointments. The cars are old, maintenance deferred, their paint faded and chipped, their seats worn. But they still function, still follow their routes with reasonable reliability. The sound of them is part of the city's rhythm, the clang of bells, the screech of metal wheels on metal rails, the electric hum of their motors. Passengers board and alight at designated stops, the flow of human traffic constant, people absorbed in their own thoughts or chatting quietly with fellow travellers. Inside the streetcars, You see the city's diversity in miniature. Workers in rough clothes heading to factories. Their faces already showing the fatigue that comes from long shifts and insufficient food. Students in school uniforms, their youth still visible despite the wartime austerity. Bags of books slung over shoulders. Conversations animated in that way particular to young people. Elderly passengers moving more slowly, holding onto rails and seats for balance, their faces lined with years and worry. Women with babies tied to their backs, the infants sleeping or looking around with wide, curious eyes, oblivious to the larger circumstances of their birth into this difficult time. Children play in streets and open spaces, their capacity for joy and energy somehow surviving despite everything. They run games that have been played for generations, modified slightly to incorporate wartime themes. They chase each other, shouting and laughing, their voices high and bright. They draw pictures in dirt with sticks, construct elaborate imaginary scenarios. Argue over rules and fairness with the intensity that children bring to their social hierarchies. Their play is both escape and processing, a way of making sense of their world through the medium of imagination and physical activity. But their play is different from what it would have been in peacetime. It is constrained by space, many areas being off-limits due to military use or damage from previous air raids. It is constrained by energy, children having less vigour than well-fed children would, tiring more quickly, needing more rest. It is shaped by absence, games that would have included fathers and older brothers now played without them. The missing participants acknowledged or not depending on the children's ability to cope with loss. And it is interrupted by drills and alarms, the sudden need to stop playing and move to shelters, the return to play afterward subdued. As if the interruption has drained some essential vitality from the activity. Factories work at capacity, or as close to capacity as depleted resources and workforce allow. The machinery runs continuously when possible. The noise of production filling the air, metal being cut and shaped and assembled. The clatter and bang and hiss of industrial process. Workers move through their shifts in a kind of trance. Repetitive motions, performed thousands of times, becoming automatic. The body knowing what to do while the mind drifts to other concerns. Safety standards have slipped, the pressure to produce overriding caution. And accidents are more common, fingers crushed, burns sustained, exhaustion leading to mistakes that in better times would have been prevented. The products of this labour are military supplies, components that will be integrated into weapon systems, uniforms and boots, canned rations, medical supplies. All the material infrastructure of war. Workers know this, understand that their labour is contributing to the fighting, though whether they feel pride or resignation or simply numbness about this varies from person to person. Some maintain a fierce dedication to the cause, believing in the war's necessity, finding meaning in their contribution. Others have grown cynical, going through the motions because they must. Because stopping is not an option, because their families depend on the wages they earn, meagre as those wages are. The weather is hot. This bears repeating because it shapes everything. The heat affects mood, making people irritable and sluggish. It affects health, dehydration and heat exhaustion being constant risks, particularly for those doing physical labour. It affects food, spoilage happening quickly in the absence of adequate refrigeration, requiring careful timing of shopping and meal preparation. It affects sleep, people lying awake in stuffy rooms, trying to find positions that might catch a breeze, listening to the sounds of the night. The cicadas singing their piercing chorus, the occasional distant sound of a train or a dog barking. In Nagasaki, to the west, a similar pattern unfolds. The city is built on hills and valleys, topography that creates distinct neighbourhoods, some high with views of the harbour, others low and industrial, clustered around shipyards and factories. The population is smaller than Hiroshima's, perhaps 250,000. But it is equally industrious, equally caught up in the demands of wartime production. The harbour is busy with military vessels, though less busy than it once was, the Japanese Navy having sustained heavy losses. The once proud fleet diminished to a shadow of its former strength. The Catholic Cathedral stands as an unusual landmark, a reminder of Nagasaki's long history of Christian presence, dating back centuries to when Portuguese missionaries first arrived. The cathedral is beautiful. European architectural elements adapted to Japanese construction methods, creating something unique. Parishioners still gather for services, though the congregation has thinned. Some members gone to war, others relocated, and the tenor of worship has changed. Prayers now heavily weighted with petitions for safety, for peace, for the survival of loved ones. In both cities' nectar, this is essential to understand. There is no sense of approaching climax, no feeling that the next days will bring anything different from the days just past. Life continues in its constrained, difficult, but manageable way. People make plans, modest plans appropriate to the circumstances. A woman decides she will mend her son's trousers this evening. A man thinks about visiting his brother on the weekend if he can get permission to travel. A teacher prepares lessons for the following week, assuming there will be a following week, assuming her students will be there to receive instruction. Conversations happen in doorways and on street corners, brief exchanges that help maintain social connection. Neighbours ask after each other's health, share information about where rice might be available, complain mildly about the heat or the difficulty of some regulation. These conversations are not particularly meaningful in themselves, but collectively they weave a social fabric that provides stability. That reminds people they are part of a community, that they are not entirely alone in their struggles. Elderly people sit in the shade, watching the activity of the street with the particular attention of those who have time and limited mobility. They notice things others miss, the slight limp of a passing worker suggesting an injury, the way a child's clothing has been carefully mended indicating a mother's care, the expression on a young woman's face revealing worry or determination or fatigue. They remember how things used to be, carry in their minds the contrast between past abundance and present scarcity. Though they are careful about voicing such comparisons, aware that nostalgia can be seen as lack of loyalty to current efforts. Temples and shrines receive visitors, people stopping to pray or simply to find a moment of quiet in sacred space. They light incense, make small offerings, bow deeply. Their prayers unspoken but intense, carrying the weight of all their fears and hopes. The rituals are ancient, unchanged by war, providing a sense of continuity with the past, a connection to something larger and more enduring than the immediate crisis. The smell of incense, the sound of bells, the visual beauty of altars and gardens, these sensory elements offer a kind of respite, a brief loosening of the tension that otherwise pervades. Young women work in offices, handling paperwork, typing reports, filing documents. The administrative machinery of both civilian and military bureaucracy requiring constant attention. They sit at desks in rooms that are too hot, typing on machines that stick and require frequent attention, stopping periodically to wipe sweat from their foreheads, to drink tepid water from bottles brought from home. The work is tedious but essential, the flow of information and orders depending on their accuracy and diligence. They chat with each other during breaks, discussing trivial matters, finding small pleasures in shared jokes or observations, maintaining morale through social connection. The rhythm of the day is measured by regular markers. The opening of shops in the morning, the whistle signalling shift changes at factories, the ringing of school bells, the call to prayer at temples, the distribution of mail when there is mail to distribute, the lighting of cooking fires in the evening, the descent of darkness and the enforcement of blackout regulations. These regular occurrences provide structure, allow people to orient themselves in time, to know what comes next, to maintain a sense of order in circumstances that often feel chaotic. Nothing feels like a final chapter because human psychology resists such dramatic framing of ordinary days. The mind does not process time in narrative arcs unless it has clear information suggesting climax is approaching. Instead, each day feels like the current iteration of an ongoing situation, part of a series that extends backward into the past and forward into an indefinite future. Tomorrow will come, and it will probably look much like today, and the day after that will look much like tomorrow. This is the default assumption, the baseline expectation that allows people to function, to plan, to maintain hope, or at least maintain effort. And so life in Hiroshima and Nagasaki continues through late July and into early August. The sun rises and sets. People wake and work and eat and sleep. The war remains the context for everything, shaping choices and limiting possibilities. But it has been the context for so long that it is simply background. The water in which everyone swims, noticed only when it changes temperature or depth dramatically. Children grow taller despite poor nutrition. Vegetables ripen in gardens. Streetcars follow their routes. Letters are written and mailed, sent off with hope that they will reach their destination, that they will be answered, that connection can be maintained across distance. The cities breathe, if we can speak of cities as living things. They pulse with the movement of people and vehicles. They produce the sounds of human activity, voices and machinery and natural elements, all blending into the distinctive acoustic signature of urban life. They contain within them countless individual stories, countless personal struggles and small victories, countless moments of tenderness and frustration and boredom and brief joy. Each person moving through these cities carries an interior world of memory and desire and worry and habit. Worlds that are invisible to external observation, but are as real and as complex as the physical structures that surround them. Hovering above all of this, unknown to everyone in these cities, is the future bearing down on them with terrible momentum. Decisions have been made in distant places by people whose names they do not know. Technologies have been developed that they cannot imagine. Events have been set in motion that will arrive soon, that will transform everything, that will divide time into before and after. But that future has not yet arrived. For now, in these days, in these hours, life continues. History's biggest moments sit on top of ordinary days. And these days in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the summer of 1945 are profoundly, achingly ordinary. Now we turn to something more elusive, harder to describe but essential to understanding what life felt like in those final weeks. We explore the emotional state of a population that has been at war for years, that has endured loss and hardship and uncertainty for so long that these things have become the texture of daily existence. We look at the psychology of waiting, of living in a suspended state where nothing resolves, where each day simply extends the previous day, where the future remains stubbornly unclear. This is not dramatic suffering, not acute crisis, but rather the slow erosion that comes from prolonged strain, the way water gradually wears down stone. People feel tired. This is the first and most pervasive sensation, a bone-deep fatigue that no amount of rest seems to cure. It is not just physical exhaustion, though that is certainly present. The result of inadequate nutrition and long working hours and the constant low-level stress of living in a war zone. It is also a tiredness of the spirit, a weariness that comes from having to be vigilant all the time, from never being able to fully relax, from carrying worry like a weight that never gets set down. People wake tired and go to bed tired, and the hours between are simply more tiredness in different forms. The fatigue shows in faces, in the way people move, in the quality of their attention. Eyes have a particular dullness, not vacant exactly, but lacking the brightness that comes from vitality and hope. Movements are economical, Energy conserved because there is so little of it to spare. People do what must be done, but nothing extra, the margin for anything beyond necessity having disappeared. Conversations are shorter, laughter more rare, the effort required to maintain social energy often feeling like more than people have to give. Children, who might be expected to have more resilience, more natural energy, also show signs of this exhaustion. They tire more easily during play, need more rest, have less capacity for sustained activity. Their laughter, when IT comes in newen, but briefer, as if they too are running on reserves that are nearly depleted. Teachers notice it in classrooms, the difficulty students have maintaining focus, the way their attention drifts, the effort it takes to engage with lessons that in normal times would be manageable. The children are not lazy or defiant, they are simply tired, their young bodies and minds struggling under conditions they were not designed to endure. Resignation sits alongside the tiredness, a kind of emotional surrender that is not the same as giving up, but rather an acceptance that things are as they are and will remain so for an indefinite period. People have stopped asking when the war will end, not because they do not care, but because asking yields no useful answer. The war will end when it ends, and until then, life continues in its constrained form. There is no point in railing against circumstances that cannot be changed. No benefit in emotional resistance to facts that are immovable. And so people settle into a kind of acceptance, not peaceful exactly, but pragmatic. This resignation is visible in how people respond to new hardships. When rations are cut again, there is no outcry, no protest. Just a weary acknowledgement and a quiet adjustment to the new reality. When another air raid siren sounds, people move to shelters without drama, without complaint, simply doing what must be done. When news arrives of another military setback or another family receives notification of a death, people absorb it with a kind of grim steadiness, adding it to the accumulation of bad news that has become normalized. But resignation is not hopelessness. Not quite. Hopelessness would imply a certainty that things will not improve, a conviction that the situation is permanent. What people feel is less defined than that, more ambiguous. They are not hopeful in any active sense, not optimistic, not believing that good things are likely to happen soon. But neither are they despairing, not convinced that suffering will last forever, not ready to declare that nothing will ever improve. They exist in between, in a grey space where both hope and despair seem to definite, to committed. Better to simply not think too much about the future, to focus on the immediate, on today, on the next hour, on the task at hand. Not hopeful, not hopeless, just enduring. This phrase captures the emotional register perhaps better than any other. Enduring is what people do when they have no better option, when stopping is not possible. When circumstances demand that you continue regardless of how you feel about it. It is the emotional equivalent of putting one foot in front of the other, not because you know where you are going, but because movement is required. Because standing still is not sustainable. Because life insists on continuing whether or not you have the energy or enthusiasm for it. Enduring requires a kind of emotional numbing, a dampening down of feeling that allows you to function without being overwhelmed. If you let yourself feel the full weight of your situation, the accumulated grief and fear and exhaustion, it would be crushing, would make it impossible to get out of bed, to go to work, to care for children, to perform the daily tasks that keep life going. And so people develop a kind of emotional distance from their own experience, a protective buffer that keeps the worst of it at arm's length. They feel things, but not with full intensity, not with the sharp clarity that might make everything unbearable. This numbing is not a choice exactly, not something people consciously decide to do, but rather an adaptive response that happens automatically. The psyche protecting itself in the only way it knows how. People become less reactive, less easily moved to strong emotion. Joy, when it appears, is muted. Fear, which is constant, becomes something you carry rather than something that overtakes you. Sadness is present but diffuse, a general state rather than acute episodes. Everything is turned down, volume reduced, intensity lowered, because this is the only way to sustain functioning over the long term. Waiting becomes a way of life. People are waiting for the war to end, though they do not know when that will be. They are waiting for letters from loved ones, though they do not know when mail will arrive. They are waiting for conditions to improve, though they have no reason to believe improvement is imminent. They are waiting for some kind of resolution, some change that will allow life to move forward rather than simply continuing in its current suspended state. But the waiting has no clear endpoint, no date on the calendar when things will shift, no milestone to look toward. It is open-ended waiting, waiting that stretches out indefinitely. Waiting that becomes not a temporary state but the permanent condition of existence. This kind of waiting is psychologically corrosive. Humans are not well equipped for it. We are built for episodic challenges, for difficulties that have beginnings and endings, for problems that can be solved or at least resolved in some way. Prolonged uncertainty, indefinite suspension. These violate something fundamental in how we process time and plan for the future. The mind keeps reaching for structure, for a sense of progression, for some indication that we are moving through this difficult period toward something different. But when that structure is absent, when each day is essentially the same as the last with no clear movement toward change, it creates a kind of temporal vertigo, a disorientation that is exhausting in its own right. People try to create small milestones to break up the monotony of waiting. The arrival of a season, the completion of a project at work, a child's birthday. These become markers that provide some sense of time passing, some illusion of progression. But these are ultimately arbitrary, personal constructions rather than genuine turning points. The war continues regardless of seasons. Work projects are repetitive rather than progressive. Birthdays arrive but change nothing fundamental. And so the markers help only marginally, providing brief moments of orientation in what is otherwise a featureless landscape of sameness. The emotional toll of this prolonged waiting manifests in various ways. Some people become irritable, their patience worn thin by the constant strain, snapping at family members over minor issues, finding themselves annoyed by things that would normally not bother them. The irritability is not really about the immediate trigger, the child who is too loud or the neighbor who talks too much, but rather the accumulated frustration of living in circumstances that offer no outlet, no resolution, nowhere to make better through effort or will. Others become withdrawn, turning inward, reducing their emotional engagement with the world around them. They speak less, initiate fewer interactions, respond to others with minimal energy. This withdrawal is protective, an attempt to conserve whatever emotional resources remain, to avoid the additional depletion that comes from maintaining relationships and social obligations. It is not that they care less about others, but rather that they have so little left to give, and what they have must be hoarded carefully for the essential tasks of survival. Still others cling to routines with an intensity that borders on rigidity, finding in the repetition of familiar patterns a kind of psychological anchor. The routine becomes important not for what it accomplishes but for its very predictability, for the way it provides structure and order in circumstances that otherwise feel chaotic and uncontrollable. Making tea in exactly the same way each morning, walking the same route to work, performing household tasks in the same sequence. These small rituals become precious, their preservation a way of asserting that some things remain stable, that not everything has been disrupted by the war. Sleep becomes both refuge and challenge. People are exhausted and crave rest, but sleep often does not come easily. The mind, having been forced to numb itself during waking hours, sometimes becomes active at night. Worries and fears surfacing, when the distractions of day are absent. People lie awake turning over concerns that they have successfully avoided thinking about during the day. The what-ifs and worst-case scenarios playing out in the darkness. Or they fall asleep quickly from sheer exhaustion, but sleep poorly, waking multiple times, dreams troubled, rest incomplete. When sleep does come deeply, it is precious a temporary escape from the weight of circumstances. For those hours, there is no war, no hunger, no worry, just the blessed oblivion of unconsciousness. Waking is difficult, the return to awareness, bringing with it the immediate resumption of all that was temporarily forgotten. Some mornings it takes a moment to remember where you are, what is happening, why everything feels so heavy. And then it all comes back, and you must begin again the work of getting through another day. The passage of time feels strange under these conditions. Days are long filled with work and worry and the small tasks of survival. Yet weeks and months seem to pass with surprising speed. Each individual day drags, but looking back, people cannot quite believe how much time has passed, how long they have been living this way. It is as if time has become simultaneously to slow and to fast, stretched out in the moment, but compressed in memory, creating a temporal experience that is disorienting, that makes it difficult to maintain a coherent sense of one's own life narrative. People find themselves thinking about the past more often, remembering what life was like before the war. Though these memories take on a dreamlike quality, as if they belong to a different person in a different world. The abundance of peacetime, even modest abundance, seems impossible from the vantage point of current scarcity. The freedom to make plans, to travel, to buy what you wanted when you wanted it, to live without constant fear. These things feel like luxuries so extreme that it is hard to believe they were once simply normal. The past becomes both a comfort and a torment, something to remember fondly and something that makes the present harder to bear by comparison. The future is harder to think about. When people do allow themselves to imagine what comes after the war, the images are vague, formless, lacking detail. They imagine peace, but what does peace look like? How does it feel? What exactly would change? The mind struggles to construct a concrete picture, having been immersed in war conditions for so long that alternative possibilities feel abstract, theoretical. And there is danger in hoping to specifically, in constructing to detailed a vision of better times. Because disappointment, when reality fails to match the vision, is painful. Safer to keep future thinking general, loose, protected from the sharp edges of specific expectation. Before catastrophe, there is almost always a long, quiet waiting. This is true across history, across circumstances. A pattern that repeats because of how humans experience time and process change. The dramatic moments, the turning points, the events that will be remembered and studied and discussed for generations. These typically emerge from extended periods of nothing much happening, of people simply living, enduring, waiting. The waiting is not passive exactly. People are still working, still managing their lives, still coping as best they can. But it is characterized by a kind of suspended animation, a holding pattern, a state of being that is neither crisis nor resolution, but something in between. And this is what people in Japan in the summer of 1945 are experiencing. They are tired. They are resigned. They are neither hopeful nor hopeless, but somewhere in that grey space between. They are simply enduring, day after day, doing what must be done, waiting without knowing what they are waiting for, carrying burdens that feel impossibly heavy and yet must be carried nonetheless. They are living in the long, quiet before something unimaginable arrives, though they have no way of knowing that the quiet is about to end, that the waiting is nearly over, that everything is about to change in ways that will make all the previous suffering seem like merely the prelude to something far worse. We arrive now at a strange and unsettling meditation, a reflection on proximity and knowledge, on how close people can be to events that will define their lives without having any awareness, that those events are approaching. We consider the distance, not measured in miles but in understanding, between those who knew what was coming and those who did not. We think about the nature of the future, how it exists already in the minds and plans of some people while remaining completely invisible to others. And we contemplate what it means to live your life normally, making ordinary decisions, when extraordinary forces are converging toward you from beyond your field of vision. In the United States, in a remote location in New Mexico, scientists and military personnel know exactly what is coming. They have spent years developing the atomic bomb, solving the enormous technical challenges of creating a weapon unlike anything that has existed before. They have conducted tests, witnessed the awesome power of nuclear fission, seen the flash of light and the mushroom cloud, and understood in that moment that they had created something that would change warfare, that would change history, that would alter the fundamental calculations of power and destruction that govern international relations. These people carry knowledge that is both specific and terrible. They know the yield of the bombs in tons of TNT equivalent. They know the altitude at which the bombs will detonate for maximum effect. They know the cities that have been selected as targets, though the final decision about exactly when and where has not yet been made. They understand the physics, the chain reaction, the release of energy, the heat and blast and radiation that will result. They can calculate casualty estimates, predict the radius of destruction, envision with scientific precision what will happen when these weapons are used. Military and political leaders in Washington know as well, though their knowledge is less technical and more strategic. They have been briefed on the weapons' capabilities, have seen reports and projections, have discussed the implications for ending the war. They have debated targets, considered alternatives, weighed the moral and practical dimensions of using such a weapon against civilian populations. They know that authorization has been given, that the final pieces are being put in place, that within days or weeks, these bombs will be dropped and the world will enter a new era. The distance between these people and the civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is enormous. Not just the physical distance of thousands of miles across the Pacific Ocean, though that is certainly real, but more significantly, the distance in understanding, in awareness, in the ability to anticipate what is about to happen. The scientists and generals and politicians exist in a completely different informational universe from the shopkeepers and factory workers and teachers going about their daily lives in Japanese cities. They inhabit the same historical moment, but their experience of that moment, their knowledge of what it contains and what it is moving toward, could not be more different. This gap is not unusual. It is, in fact, the normal structure of how history unfolds. Decisions are made by small groups of people with access to information and authority that the vast majority do not have. Events are set in motion through processes that are invisible to those who will be most affected by them. The future arrives in stages known first to a very few, gradually becoming visible to larger circles, and finally manifesting in ways that everyone experiences but that catch most people by surprise because they had no advance warning, no opportunity to prepare, no chance to understand what was coming until it had already arrived. But the atomic bomb represents an extreme version of this pattern, because the gap between what is known by those in power and what can be imagined by ordinary people is so vast. It is not simply that civilians in Japan do not know that this particular weapon exists or that it is about to be used against them. It is that the very concept of such a weapon is outside their frame of reference, beyond the boundaries of what seems possible. The destructive power being prepared to unleash on them is so far beyond anything in their experience or imagination that even if they were told about it, they would struggle to believe it, to comprehend it, to take seriously something that sounds more like fantasy than reality. Consider a woman in Hiroshima going about her day in late July. She wakes early, prepares a simple breakfast for her family, sends her children off to school. She spends the morning cleaning, mending clothes, tending her small garden. In the afternoon, she walks to the market, carefully using her ration coupons to obtain rice and vegetables. She stops to chat with a neighbour about the heat, about the difficulties of managing a household with such limited resources. She returns home, prepares dinner, shares the meal with her family, listens to the radio for a while in the evening, performs the blackout procedures, and goes to bed. Her concerns are immediate and practical. She worries about whether her husband, serving somewhere in the Pacific, is safe. She worries about feeding her children adequately. She worries about the next air raid, about whether her home will survive if bombs fall nearby. She has no way of knowing that on a small island in the Pacific, a B-29 bomber is being prepared for a special mission. She has no way of knowing that scientists have assembled a device containing uranium that, when detonated at the right altitude above a city, will release energy equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. She has no way of knowing that her city has been selected as a target, chosen precisely because it has not been heavily bombed before, because military planners want to assess the weapon's full destructive capability on a relatively intact urban area. She has no way of knowing that within days, everyone she knows, everything she can see, the entire world she inhabits, will be erased or transformed in an instant of unprecedented violence. The woman is not unintelligent. She is not oblivious or naive. She is simply living within the limits of available information, making sense of her world with the knowledge she has access to, which is the only thing any human can do. Her world makes sense on its own terms. The challenges she faces are real and significant within the context of what she knows. The future she anticipates, while uncertain and difficult, is imaginable, is constructed from elements that exist in her current reality. The war might end, things might get better or they might get worse, but all of it within a range of possibilities that her experience and knowledge allow her to envision. She is close to something she cannot imagine. Literally close, in the sense that the weapon will detonate above her city, perhaps above her neighborhood, perhaps nearly above her own home. And close in time, days or a week away, the final preparations already being made, the countdown already in progress. But the proximity is irrelevant because she has no awareness of it, no ability to detect it, no way of knowing that the normal rhythms of her life are about to be violently interrupted. This is true for hundreds of thousands of people, each living their own version of daily life, each carrying their own concerns and hopes and fears, each navigating the challenges of wartime existence with whatever resources and strategies they possess, each completely unaware that the future bearing down on them is not the future they imagine, not a continuation or even an intensification of what they have been experiencing, but something categorically different, something that will divide their lives and their city's history into absolute before and after. The scientists and military planners understand this gap, at least intellectually. They know that the people who will be affected have no warning, no preparation, no understanding of what is about to happen. Some of them feel troubled by this, uncomfortable with the asymmetry of knowledge, with the godlike position of determining the fate of so many without their awareness or consent. Others have made their peace with it, justified it through strategic necessity, through the calculation that using these weapons will end the war sooner and ultimately save lives. Both American and Japanese. But all of them understand that they are operating in a realm of knowledge and power that is fundamentally separate from the experience of those who will bear the consequences. There is something almost metaphysical about this separation, this division between those who know the future and those who do not. It highlights the contingent nature of reality, The way that what is true depends on perspective, on position, on access to information. For the woman in Hiroshima, the future is uncertain but imaginable, bounded by the parameters of her experience. For the military planners, the future is specific and planned, a sequence of events that will unfold according to a predetermined schedule. Both futures are real in the minds of those holding them, but only one corresponds to what will actually happen. And the people living in the doomed cities have no way of knowing that their version of the future is wrong, that they are constructing plans and hopes and expectations based on a picture of reality that is about to be violently overturned. The future arrives unevenly. This is the core insight, the fundamental truth about how history moves forward. It does not come to everyone at the same time. It arrives first in the minds of those creating it, those making decisions and setting events in motion. Then it arrives for those who are adjacent to power, who have some access to information, even if they lack decision-making authority. Then it begins to manifest in material reality, becoming visible to those with the right vantage point or expertise to recognize what they are seeing. And finally, it arrives for everyone else, crashing into their lives with sudden force, transforming everything in ways they had no ability to anticipate or prepare for. People in positions of power live further forward in time than ordinary people do. They see what is coming because they are causing it to come, because they have information that allows them to predict trajectories. Because their decisions shape outcomes in ways that give them advanced knowledge of what those outcomes will be. This is not about superior intelligence or wisdom, though those may be factors. It is about position, about access, about being inside the circles where plans are made and information is shared. And this positional advantage in time creates enormous disparities in how people experience the same historical moment. For the civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Zuma of 1945 is a continuation what has come before. More of the same difficult endurance they have been practicing for years. For the scientists and military leaders, the summer of 1945 is a threshold, a moment of transformation they have been working toward, the culmination of enormous effort and the beginning of something entirely new. They are living in the same days, but those days mean completely different things, contain completely different possibilities, point toward completely different futures. And there is no way to bridge this gap, no mechanism by which the knowledge held by the few could be transmitted to the many, even if there were a desire to do so. The secrecy is too complete, the information too sensitive, the implications too enormous. And even if someone tried to tell the people of these cities what was coming, tried to explain about nuclear fission and uranium and the unprecedented destructive power about to be unleashed, would they believe it? Could they integrate such information into their understanding of the world? Or would it seem too fantastic, too impossible, too much like the ravings of someone unhinged from reality? The imagination has limits. This is part of what makes the gap so unbridgeable. People can imagine variations on what they know, extrapolations from their experience. Things that are different in degree but not in kind. But something that is categorically new, that operates on principles they do not understand, that exceeds by orders of magnitude anything they have encountered, this is very difficult for the mind to grasp. And without the ability to imagine it, there is no way to prepare for it, no way to protect against it, no way to adjust your behavior or your plans to account for it. So people continue their lives, making decisions that assume a certain kind of future, investing energy in concerns that seem important within their frame of reference, not knowing that the framework itself is about to collapse. A man worries about whether he will have enough fuel to heat his home next winter, not knowing there will be no winter, no home, possibly no him. A woman plants vegetables she will never harvest. A child learns lessons he will never have opportunity to use. These are not wasted efforts exactly, because the people doing them have no choice, no alternative, no way of knowing that they are investing in a future that will not arrive. And there is tragedy in this, profound and irreducible tragedy, not just in what will happen, but in the fact that it will happen to people who could not have prevented it, could not have prepared for it, could not have done anything differently because they lacked the essential ingredient of knowledge. They will be struck down not because of anything they did or failed to do, not because of choices or errors or sins, but simply because they happened to be in a particular place at a particular time, living their ordinary lives in the path of extraordinary forces about to be unleashed. The future, in those final days, is like a wave already formed far out at sea, travelling toward shore, gathering mass and momentum, inevitable in its approach but invisible to those standing on the beach, watching the calm water near the shore, feeling the gentle lapping of small waves at their feet, having no idea that behind the horizon something enormous is coming, something that will sweep over them with force they cannot imagine, that will change everything they know in the span of seconds. The wave is already moving toward them. The distance is shrinking. Time is running out. But they cannot see it, and so they continue their lives, making plans, having conversations, maintaining routines, not knowing that the world they inhabit is about to end. We come now to the end of our journey tonight, to the final moments before everything changes, though the people living in those moments do not know they are final, do not know they are standing at the edge of something that will transform their world beyond recognition. We end not abruptly, but by walking gently toward that moment, understanding what it meant, how it arrived, and what it revealed about the nature of history itself. We reflect on what we have seen together, on the texture of life in those last days, on what it means to live in history without knowing that you are living in history. Imagine a city at dusk, the particular quality of light that comes as day transitions to evening. The sky taking on shades of orange and pink and purple, the sun lowering toward the horizon. Hiroshima in early August, the heat of the day finally beginning to ease. Shadows lengthening across streets and between buildings, the world softening into that brief period before darkness falls. The city is tired, as it has been tired for years now, worn down by war and scarcity and the constant low-level anxiety of uncertain times. But it is also still alive, still functioning, still home to hundreds of thousands of people whose lives continue despite everything. People are finishing their workdays, emerging from factories and offices, beginning the journey home. They walk through streets they know intimately, past landmarks that have been there as long as they can remember, through neighborhoods where they have lived for years or perhaps their entire lives. The familiarity is comforting, this knowing where you are, this being able to navigate your world with automatic ease. They pass others heading in different directions, brief nods of recognition, small exchanges with neighbors, the minimal social interactions that maintain a sense of community without requiring much energy. Streetcars make their final runs of the evening, carrying workers back to their homes on the outskirts of the city. The cars are crowded, people standing pressed together, holding onto straps and rails, bodies swaying in unison with the movement of the vehicle. No one speaks much, the silence of exhaustion filling the space, each person lost in their own thoughts or in no thoughts at all, simply existing in the space between work and home, public and private, the demands of the day and the rest that evening might bring. Shops are closing, the daily commerce coming to an end. Shopkeepers pull down shutters, lock doors, secure whatever inventory remains. The market vendors pack up their stalls, empty now of the small amounts they had to sell, everything gone or nearly gone. Tomorrow they will do it again. Set up early, arrange what little they have, hope that somehow there will be enough. Money is counted, put away, the accounting of another day complete. Modest profits barely sufficient to sustain the business, barely sufficient to feed their own families, but sufficient nonetheless, enough to continue, enough to return tomorrow and the next day and the next. In homes throughout the city, cooking fires are being lit, dinner prepared from whatever ingredients are available. The smell of rice cooking, of miso soup warming, of vegetables being stir-fried in minimal oil, these scents drift through neighbourhoods. The olfactory signature of evening routines being performed in countless kitchens. Women work with practiced efficiency, their movements economical, no energy wasted. Meals that would have seemed inadequate before the war, but that now represent the best that can be managed with rations and resources stretched thin. Families gather for the evening meal. Fathers, who are still present, too old or too essential in civilian roles to have been drafted. Mothers, who have held households together through years of increasing difficulty. Children, who have grown up knowing nothing but war, for whom scarcity and fear are simply normal, not aberrations, but the baseline of existence. They sit together, share what food there is, the meal quick and quiet, conversation minimal. Everyone tired, everyone looking forward to the few hours before sleep when they can simply rest. After dinner, the evening tasks. Dishes to be washed, clothes to be mended, children to be supervised as they complete homework or prepare for bed. These are the mundane activities that fill the time, that provide structure, that allow families to function as families despite the larger circumstances pressing in from outside. There is a kind of stubborn normalcy to it all, a refusal to let the war completely consume private life. An insistence that some things remain unchanged, that home can still be a refuge, even if that refuge is smaller and more fragile than it used to be. As darkness approaches, the blackout preparations begin. Windows are covered, curtains drawn tight, any gaps sealed to ensure no light escapes. This has been done so many times that it requires no thought, hands moving through the familiar motions. Checking and double-checking, making sure everything is secure. The neighbourhood wardens will make their rounds soon, looking for violations, and no one wants the embarrassment of being caught. The reprimand, the suggestion that they are not taking their civic responsibilities seriously. Inside the darkened homes, families gather in single rooms, conserving light and fuel. A radio might be playing softly, broadcasts that mix news and music and propaganda. The standard evening programming that people listen to more from habit than interest. Or perhaps there is no radio, just the quiet of family members sitting together. Too tired for much conversation, simply sharing space, finding comfort in proximity even when there is little energy for active engagement. Children are put to bed, the evening rituals performed one more time. A parent sits beside a futon or bed, perhaps telling a brief story, or simply sitting in companionable silence while the child settles into sleep. The children close their eyes, some drifting off quickly, others lying awake a while longer, listening to the sounds of the house. The muffled voices of adults, the occasional creak of floorboards, the distant sound of the city settling into night. Sleep comes, as it always does, pulling them gently into unconsciousness. Their small bodies at rest, their breathing slow and steady. Adults stay up a bit longer, attending to final tasks or simply sitting quietly with their thoughts. The fatigue is profound, and sleep will come easily once they lie down. But there is something about these evening hours, the privacy of them. The sense that the day's obligations have been met and there is a brief space of time that belongs, eventually, they to go to bed, lying down on futons spread across tatami mats, pulling thin covers over themselves, closing their eyes against the darkness that is already complete. And the city sleeps, or as much as cities sleep, the activity diminishing but never stopping entirely. Night shift workers continuing their labour in factories. Soldiers on duty at military installations. A few people who cannot sleep, who lie awake with thoughts too loud or worries too pressing to allow rest. But mostly, the city is quiet, dark, still. The hundreds of thousands of lives it contains temporarily suspended in sleep, breathing in unison, dreaming or not dreaming, at rest after another day of endurance. The night passes, hour by hour, the earth turning slowly toward dawn. In the Pacific, far to the east, decisions have been made, orders have been given, preparations have been completed. A bomber lifts into the air from a small island, carrying its payload toward Japan, toward a city that has no idea it has been chosen. The plane flies through the darkness, navigating by instruments, the crew quiet, focused, carrying knowledge that weighs heavier than the weapon itself. Morning begins as mornings always begin. The Sunriseman August 1945 lights across the city, touching rooftops and treetops first, then gradually descending into streets and through windows. People wake, stretch, rise from their beds. The rituals of morning commence in countless households. Water is heated for tea, faces are washed, clothing is put on. Children are roused, reluctant to leave sleep, encouraged with gentle words or firmer instructions depending on temperament and circumstance. The city comes to life in its usual pattern. Shops begin to open, shutters rolled up, doors unlocked. Market vendors set up their stalls in the cool morning air. Streetcars begin their routes, the first passengers of the day boarding, heading to work, to school, to whatever tasks await them. Factory whistles sound, signalling the start of shifts. Teachers arrive at schools, preparing classrooms for students who will arrive soon. The machinery of daily life engages, everyone taking their place in the familiar pattern. The morning is clear, the sky a deep blue, the kind of perfect summer day that might almost make you forget there is a war. If it were not for the empty shelves and the absent men and the pervasive tiredness that touches everything. The heat is already building, promising another day where movement will be slow, where shade will be sought, where everyone will count the hours until evening brings some relief. At 8:15 in the morning, a sound. High above the city, higher than anyone is looking, a single bomber releases its payload. The bomb falls through clear air, descending toward the city centre, toward the hundreds of thousands of people going about their Monday morning, toward the shopkeepers and the factory workers and the school children and the mothers and the elderly and the infants, toward all those ordinary lives being lived in ordinary ways. And then the flash. Brighter than 1,000 suns, brighter than anything anyone has ever seen, a light that burns through closed eyelids. That seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. That fills the world completely for a moment, that stretches impossibly long, and is also instantaneous. The temperature at the centre reaches millions of degrees. Matter itself transforms, buildings and bodies and air all becoming something else in the span of milliseconds. The blast wave follows, moving outward at supersonic speed, a wall of pressure and heat that levels everything in its path. Structures that stood for decades, for centuries, are erased in seconds. Wood ignites before the flames can even reach it, spontaneous combustion from the radiant heat. Glass melts, metal bends and twists, concrete crumbles. The sound comes after, a roar so loud it seems to split the earth itself, though most who might have heard it are already gone. The mushroom cloud rises, that terrible iconic shape, climbing kilometres into the sky, carrying with it debris and dust and the vaporized remains of what was once a living city. From a distance, it is almost beautiful, this towering column of smoke and fire, this monument to human capability to destroy. But beneath it, in the space where Hiroshima existed moments ago, there is only devastation on a scale that defies comprehension. The world has changed. In an instant, in the time it takes to draw breath, everything different. The people who were walking to work, who were preparing breakfast, who were opening shops, who were sitting in classrooms, most of them are simply gone. Their existence ended without warning, without time to understand what was happening, without opportunity to say goodbye or make peace, or do anything except cease to be. Those farther from the centre, those who survived the initial blast, face burns and injuries and radiation that will claim many of them in the hours and days and weeks to come. And this is how history works. It changes everything. But first, it looks like nothing at all. It looks like an ordinary morning, like people going about their lives, like the continuation of the familiar. And then, in a moment too brief to measure, everything transforms. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The familiar becomes incomprehensible. The world that was ceases to exist, and a new world. A world that includes this. A world that must now account for this, that must now live with the knowledge of what humans are capable of doing to each other. That world begins. 3 days later, it happens again. Nagasaki, another city, another population going about their daily lives, another moment when everything changes. The pattern repeats, the flash and the blast and the mushroom cloud and the devastation. And again, the world must adjust its understanding of what is possible, what humans will do, what the future might hold. And that is where we end tonight, not with details of suffering that would disturb your rest, but with the acknowledgement that this happened. That the ordinary days we have walked through together led to this moment, that the people whose lives we have imagined were real, were human, were living and breathing and hoping and fearing and loving and worrying, and then, for so many of them, were not. History arrived. The unimaginable became real. The future that existed only in the minds of a few became the present for everyone. Let yourself rest now, carrying with you the knowledge that we have honoured these lives tonight, that we have seen them as they were, in their humanity and their ordinariness and their dignity. Let this story settle gently into your consciousness, not as nightmare but as remembrance, not as horror but as understanding. The world changed that morning, but the people in it were simply people, like us, like everyone who has ever lived, trying their best with what they knew, loving what they loved, enduring what they had to endure, living their lives right up until the moment those lives ended. History changes everything, but it always begins with ordinary days, ordinary people, ordinary moments that feel like they will continue forever, until they do not, until everything shifts, until the world becomes something new, something that must be understood differently, something that carries within it the memory of what was lost and the knowledge of what became possible. Good night. Reste well. Remember them.